Welcome back to the deep dive. If you want to understand American economic history, you have to understand the late 19th century, the Gilded Age.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was a time defined by, well, explosive industrial growth, massive wealth disparity, and one central glaring contradiction.
That contradiction is really our mission today. We're diving deep into that tension between the stated economic ideal as a fair and the political and corporate reality.
Right.
We want to show you exactly where the government drew the line between hands-off and hands-on, and maybe why that line usually favored the wealthiest industrialists.
Okay, let's start by framing this core philosophy. We all kind of know laissez-faire means generally leaving the economy alone.
Mhm.
But how did Gilded Age policymakers and, the tycoons interpret that philosophy? It wasn't just a benign idea, was it? It sounds like it was used to rationalize some pretty immense suffering.
Exactly. For the supporters of this doctrine, and they were drawing from classical economic thought, Adam Smith and all that.
Wealth of nations.
Right. The competitive market was seen as this self-regulating machine guided by its own invisible hand. They didn't just believe government shouldn't intervene, they believed intervention was actively harmful.
And the shocking application of that belief, what did that look like in practice?
It meant that economic downturns, like the severe panics of 1873 and 1893, were viewed not as failures requiring a federal response, but as, get this, natural and necessary corrections.
Wow, necessary.
Yeah, they argued the system had to purge itself of weak businesses and speculation. For this group, the pain experienced by millions of Americans during these depressions was simply the inevitable, required medicine for the market.
Which brings us to maybe the ultimate poster child for this hard line, President Grover Cleveland.
Oh, definitely.
He was in office when the Panic of 1893 hit, sparking just massive unemployment and hunger, yet his response was to do virtually nothing. How did he rationalize standing by while people starved?
Cleveland was an absolutely uncompromising defender of this strict non-interventionist view. His justification was really rooted in the fear of creating dependency.
Dependency.
He sincerely believed that federal assistance, even facing mass economic collapse, would be morally corrupting. It would fundamentally change the American character from one of self-reliance to one of reliance on the state.
That is an incredible statement given the scale of the crisis.
Yeah.
He actively opposed help.
He did. Consistently.
Yeah.
He opposed high tariffs that might distort trade. He vetoed pension bills he thought were wasteful.
Right.
And famously, he dismissed urgent requests for drought relief for struggling farmers, insisting the government should not provide, quote, paternal care to the citizens.
Paternal care.
For Cleveland, the federal government's sole role was ensuring stability, like maintaining the gold standard maybe, but not acting as a social safety net. Not at all.
And this wasn't just policy, it was the narrative of the age, pushed by influential figures.
Absolutely. People like Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, he constantly reinforced this idea of self-reliance, free labor.
The message being?
The message was clear. Success was attainable through individual merit and hard work in a system that theoretically rewarded competition.
That narrative was essential, wasn't it? Because it shifted the blame for failure onto the individual.
Precisely. It deflected attention from the structural problems, from the effects of the very policies they advocated. But here is where we hit the real breaking point, the transition from this soaring rhetoric to a much more cynical reality.
Okay.
If laissez-faire meant no intervention, then why did the government intervene constantly when it benefited corporations?
That's the key question. Because the same corporate titans who preached the gospel of the free market were at the same time destroying competition at home.
They absolutely were. The very spirit of Adam Smith individuals competing freely was systematically violated. You look at John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie.
The big names.
Right. While the rhetoric celebrated competition, they were consolidating control over oil and steel, respectively. They didn't compete, they merged, they crushed competition.
And how exactly did they do that? We hear terms like trusts and pools. For the listener, what did that actually mean in practice?
Well, a trust or a pool was essentially an agreement, often legally murky, kind of in the shadows, where competing companies placed their stock under the control of a single group of trustees.
Okay.
This allowed them to act as a single, massive entity. They could control production, set prices, and systematically eliminate smaller rivals. This consolidation was the opposite of competition. It created these behemoths, like Standard Oil and U.S. Steel, which held just devastating power over prices and distribution.
So on one hand, the government is strictly hands-off when it comes to regulating monopolies that are crushing the consumer and the worker.
Right, leave it alone.
But on the other hand, we see the government being remarkably hands-on when it comes to securing opportunities for those same corporations abroad.
The selective nature of this intervention is just fascinating. The federal government resisted domestic regulation that might, constrain corporate profits, but it became an aggressive agent of expansion globally, securing markets, securing resources necessary for industrial growth.
Give us a prime example of this aggressive, selective intervention overseas.
Okay, look at the Pacific. Between 1893 and 1898, American sugar planters in Hawaii, who stood to gain immensely from annexation, they orchestrated the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy.
With U.S. help.
Yes, with the active support of U.S. officials. The resulting annexation in 1898 was often framed in political terms, but its economic impact was immediate, securing Pacific trade rates, guaranteeing lucrative new markets for American enterprise, pure economic gain.
That's a really clear case of political action directly serving capitalist interests. Did they repeat that playbook in other regions?
They did, notably in Asia. Around the turn of the century, the U.S. implemented the open-door policy in China.
The open door policy, right?
This wasn't some kind of altruism. It was a strategic move to guarantee equal access for American businesses to Asian markets and resources. Amidst fierce European imperial competition, the U.S. government intervened politically to ensure American corporations wouldn't be shut out.
So carving out space for American business.
Exactly. And even something like the purchase of Alaska in 1867, initially mocked as Seward's folly.
Seward's icebox.
Right. It quickly validated its cost with rich deposits of gold and oil. The government was quick to act when corporate profits were potentially involved overseas.
The public certainly noticed this contradiction, though. They saw monopolies thriving, workers suffering. That had to create pressure, right? It eventually forced a legal pivot away from that pure laissez-faire orthodoxy.
That's right. When the system becomes so visibly skewed, faith in the doctrine erodes. The first major legislative crack in the laissez-faire wall came with the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887.
This was a direct response to the railroads, wasn't it? Which everyone depended on, but which were operating with zero accountability. What exactly were the railroads doing that sparked such outrage?
Oh, the railroads engaged in incredibly discriminatory pricing. Crucially, they offered secret rebates, massive discounts to powerful shippers like Standard Oil.
So the big guys got a deal.
A huge deal. If you were a small competitor, you were paying rates that were drastically higher than your massive rival, meaning you simply couldn't compete on cost. Plus, they often charged higher rates for short hauls, which really burdened farmers who had no choice but to use the single local line.
Just squeezing them. So the ICC was created to fight that unfairness.
It was. The Interstate Commerce Commission became the first federal regulatory agency. It was created to ensure that railroad rates were reasonable and just, and to prohibit these discriminatory practices. It was a landmark moment.
How so?
Because the federal government affirmed its authority to regulate private enterprise when it acted against the public interest. That was huge.
But the ICC, in its early days, was often described as toothless, wasn't it? It didn't actually fix things right away.
No, it was hobbled from the start. It lacked critical enforcement power, it lacked funding, and maybe most importantly, the courts consistently favored the railroads in legal disputes.
The courts.
Yeah. This meant that while the principle of regulation was established, the actual practice was pretty weak for a long time.
Then, 3 years later, in 1890, Congress tried to tackle the trusts directly with the Sherman Antitrust Act. They declared illegal all combinations and restraint of trade and attempts to monopolize commerce. That sounds powerful. Sounds like it could break up Rockefeller's empire.
Theoretically, yes. It definitely addressed the widespread public outrage. People were furious about the trusts. However, the language of the act was notoriously vague.
Vague how?
Well, restraint of trade wasn't clearly defined, making it difficult to prosecute corporations effectively. But the most stunning consequence of the act wasn't its weakness against the trusts. It was how it was almost immediately weaponized against a completely different group.
Okay, tell us about that. Who ended up on the receiving end of the Sherman Act, the law supposedly designed to protect people from monopolies?
Labor unions.
Unions? Really?
Yes. In a profound irony, courts frequently interpreted union strikes and boycotts as combinations in restraint of trade.
No way!
Yes. So the law created to curb the power of massive corporations was applied far more often in its early years to crush organized labor, the very groups pushing back against corporate dominance.
That tells you everything you need to know about where the power structures resided during the Gilded Age.
Wow, it's quite something.
Despite that initial subversion, though, the Sherman Act did set a vital precedent, didn't it? It wasn't totally useless in the long run.
It absolutely did. It established the core legal framework.
Yeah.
It was the foundation that would eventually be dusted off and truly utilized decades later during the Progressive Era, particularly by President Theodore Roosevelt.
TR, the trust buster.
Exactly. He finally began using the act to break up trusts in earnest. So it was the principle that mattered initially, even if it took years for the government to gain the political will and maybe the legal clarity to enforce it properly against corporations.
If we connect this back to the grand sweep of American history, this whole conflict between, hands-off capitalism and necessary regulation, it feels like a theme that predates the Gilded Age entirely.
Oh, it is. It's a continuous thread woven right into the fabric of the nation. You can trace this foundational tension back to the very start. Think about Alexander Hamilton arguing for a strong national government actively promoting commerce and industry.
Right, the national bank, tariffs.
While Thomas Jefferson championed a limited federal government supporting agrarian independence, much less intervention.
And even in the 19th century, before this massive industrialization, we had proposals like Henry Clay's American System,
The American system.
with its call for federally funded infrastructure projects, roads, canals. Those were constantly met with fierce critics who argued it was an unconstitutional intrusion into the economy.
Exactly. So the Gilded Age didn't invent this debate. It merely revived these foundational questions in a new, much more complex context. Instead of arguing about roads and canals, they were arguing about railroads, oil, and these massive industrial empires. The struggle to define the proper scope of government, should it be a partner to capital, a regulator, or just a minimalist entity, that's arguably the defining theme of American economic history.
So for you, the key takeaway from the Gilded Age, it's really the story of rhetoric failing reality. The ideal was a hands-off government for everyone.
Supposedly.
The political reality was a government that intervened swiftly and aggressively to aid massive corporate expansion overseas, while insisting it could not offer aid to struggling citizens at home.
The crucial insight, I think, is that political principles often yield surprisingly quickly to immediate power and profit. When powerful industrial interests saw money in Hawaii or China, the notion of laissez-faire just vanished instantly.
Yeah.
The debate really centers on who gets to decide when the government is required to leave alone and when it's required to lend a hand, and who benefits from that decision.
And as a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to take away, look again at that Sherman Antitrust Act. A law meant to protect the public from the highest concentrations of economic power was, in its early years, overwhelmingly used against labor unions fighting for basic protections. What does that historical irony tell you about the resilience and adaptability of power structures when faced with new regulation? Consider how quickly the legal system can be, co-opted or subverted to maintain the status quo, even when the law's intent seems clear.
Something to definitely ponder until next time.
We'll see you on the next Deep Dive.